Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I am just going to double check, and if somebody can tell me you're seeing my screen as
Good on
a
both.
PowerPoint.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to talk about management for insecticide resistance, and we have had a lot of great speakers throughout the day. There's a lot of points in my talk that have already been touched on by all of the previous speakers, which goes to show that there are some important themes that are coming out in the summit, and that a lot of people are on the same page when it comes to insecticide resistance. So to get started, let me get my here out. Okay, there we go. There are a lot of threats to effective vector control that are out there. There are regulatory actions, whether you can use a particular insecticide or not, what amounts you can use. There are pesticide attitudes. There are groups of citizens who may have a very bad impression of some of the tools that we use to control mosquitoes. So they may say in a local community, we want you to control our mosquitoes, but you can't use X, Y, and Z. And the local health department or mosquito control program then has to find a way to accomplish that and still interact with and engage with their local communities, and also getting their local communities to buy into their role in vector control and what they can do personally outside of what a government entity might do to help them protect themselves. Their funds are always an issue. There's a lot of great ideas out there, and sometimes there's you know what you need to do, but you just can't do it because you can't afford to do it. And I lump in also incentives for new control insecticides and methods, because it's very expensive for companies to produce new mosquito control products, particularly for vector control, and get a return on that investment. So as a result, the insecticides that we use in mosquito control usually are developed for use in agriculture before we see them being able to be used or registered for use in vector control. And then there's resistance, which can further erode our ability to provide effective vector control, just because the products that we're trying to use may not necessarily be working for us anymore. There are a lot of other threats to vector control, but these are just some of the big ones. And then I want to remind everybody, and this has been touched on by several of the speakers before, is that what actually influences insecticide resistance to develop is not just vector control itself. There are influences on what's being used in agriculture. There are influences in what urban pest control companies might be using when people contract spraying for cockroaches or bugs in their lawn or their gardens. And then what homeowners and businesses may be applying themselves. All of those can influence both the development of resistance in mosquitoes and the underlying mechanisms that develop in a particular population. And also, besides just insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, fertilizers, non-point source pollution runoff, what washes off of the street into the storm drain where larval development occurs, can also influence which direction or which resistance mechanism may be selected in a particular place. And we've also heard that you can have more than one mechanism present in a resistant population. So we've heard about the enzymes, the esterases, the GSTs, oxidases, We've heard about the altered target sites, the KDR, which is DDT in the pyrethroids, and then the ACE mutation, which affects the target site for the organophosphates and the carbamates. So any one of those alone, any combination of that can be in the mix in your resistant mosquito. So it's a very complex problem and issue. And just detecting resistance itself isn't always going to give you a clear answer to what you should do for managing it. So really the first step of managing resistance, it's kind of this iterative cycle where you go out and you do testing and you detect it. Based on that detection, you may or may not take an action to mitigate the resistance or to try and prevent it from developing. And then you evaluate, was that action effective? And at the same time, you're continuing to do this detection, action, and evaluating. And people often don't evaluate changes in their program. They just say, oh, we needed to rotate chemicals. They rotate chemicals, but they don't necessarily evaluate, was that actually the right action to take? So we heard there are many tests that are out there for detecting resistance and its underlying mechanisms. Choosing which one is going to be a local decision. The lab testing like bottle bioassay, topical application, WHO assay, these lab-based assays are a great screening tool to use to look for changes in a population, but they don't necessarily mean that your products are not working out in the field. And as we heard before, you really need to follow that up with some sort of product evaluation, some sort of field testing to see, to confirm those results. But they are a great way over time to monitor for trends in your population. If you detect resistance, is it getting worse? Is it staying the same? Are you seeing resistance to things you're not using? Are they getting worse? Are they staying the same? What underlying mechanisms are you seeing? All of those things go into that basic surveillance. Where we have the biggest issue when it comes to insecticide resistance is we have a real data vacuum on what path works when resistance is detected. And I was very encouraged to see a lot of the work that's being done around the world that's trying to address that data vacuum on what choice you make and how it is actually affecting both the control of the vectors and potentially the transmission of the diseases in your part of the world that you're most interested in. So when resistance is detected, you have to decide on an action. And again, that action can be no action, that you detect resistance, but it's not really impacting your overall control because it's a very weak mechanism that's underlying. The resistance is not strong enough that you're seeing products failing in the field. It can need to be a drastic action that, oh my gosh, adulticides aren't working for me anymore. Because as we've seen in many places, there's resistance to both organophosphates and carbamates and maybe pyrethroids all in the same area. And if those are the only three modes of action you have to work with, what do you do then? So with that said, there are some classic areas of resistance management, and these theories have been around for decades. They're nothing new, and hopefully if you're new to insecticide resistance, you're learning something, and if you're very experienced in the realm of insecticide resistance, you've probably heard all of these before, but repetition is always a good thing. Sometimes we tend to forget over time and need to be reminded of things. So I'm going to go through each of these. There is management by moderation, and just like the title of this management strategy, it's using lower doses and using fewer applications so that you're not putting a lot of pressure on your population. It's using chemicals that are short-lived in the environment. And I realize that, you know, we across the globe are dealing with different biologies. We're dealing with Anopheles and Culex and Aedes, but we're also dealing with different diseases and different situations on how we can perform control. So in Africa, where you have rural villages that you really don't have the resources to use short-lived chemicals, using residual sprays, using bed nets so that you only have to visit these villages, you know, maybe once a year or once every 18 months, really precludes you to be able to use short-lived chemicals. Here in the United States, the majority of our mosquito control is done from the middle of a public street using a ULV spray, and those ULV products are formulated to have a very short half-life. Some of our products here have a half-life of only an hour, and then they dissipate from the environment so that we're not affecting other insect species, and we're not we're minimizing the insecticide burden on the environment and on humans. Using local treatments if possible. So they're really the basis of integrated mosquito management or integrated vector management is doing surveillance, looking at your mosquito populations. If you have very low populations and there's no disease transmission going on, perhaps you don't need to be treating as intensively as if you're at the height of a dengue outbreak or some other outbreak. The concept of having refugia, of having areas that are not treated by vector control can be important, because that gives you places where susceptible mosquitoes can reside, that can then move their susceptible genes back into areas where you have kind of used your control method and reduced populations. This change in economic threshold is kind of a holdover, because these theories are not just for vector control, they're for agriculture and urban pest control as well. In vector control, we don't really have an economic threshold, whereas for a crop, you can have a certain amount of damage to that crop before you start losing money on it. So that one doesn't really apply to vector control. And then you have the exact opposite. You have management by saturation. So you have these resistance genes out in the population, and you render them functionally recessive by using such a high dosage that that gene, that resistance in the particular individual is still overcome by the insecticide. Incorporating synergist into the product is another way of rendering that resistance gene functionally recessive. This assumes that the genes for resistance are dominant in compounds that you're using, again, have short residual actions, which is not necessarily the case for some of the malaria control and other vector control that needs to be done when you're using wall spraying as a strategy or when you're using nets. And again, for this to work, you need refugia and immigration. And I mentioned, before I get too much further, I do want to mention that these management strategies are really strategies for new chemicals to prevent the development of insecticide resistance. Once you have it, these strategies are perhaps not so useful. And then there's management by multiple attack. That's the third strategy. That's where you use a mix of chemicals. And the idea behind this is that you have two different chemicals with two different modes of action, which makes it much harder for the insect to be able to develop some sort of resistance that is going to work on both of those modes of action at the same time. And then there's the alternation of chemicals using the concept of rotating chemicals or applying them in mosaics. And again, the assumption for this to work, as Dina pointed out in her talk, there's no initial resistance. The resistance mechanisms are different. And they have similar decay rates in the field. So if you mix two chemicals together and one has a very short residual action and one has a very long one that lasts for months, then effectively you're negating your mixture of chemicals because one of them is out there all the time selecting for insecticide resistance, and the other one is only there for short periods of time. I want to pause a little bit and talk just a little bit about our larvicides. The focus of all of the talks before this one have really been on adulticides, and this talk is also really on adulticides. But when it comes to the larvicides that are available for vector control, almost every larvicide product out there has a different mode of action. BTI works on the midgut. This Lysibacillus spiricus works on the hindgut. And then you have insect growth regulators that are mimicking juvenile hormone, or you can have Timophos, which is working like one of our, well, it's an organophosphate, so it's working on the acetylcholine esterase in the nerve synapse. And so when it comes to larvicides and larvicide resistance, anything, almost anything that you follow on with, if you detect resistance in larvicides, is going to be a different mode of action. And there are products out there that actually combine some of these different larvicides. So again, they're a mixture of chemical with mixture of modes of action. And in the chat right before this started, I gave you a link to some videos on how to do larvicide testing from the Center for Vector Biology in California, Dr. Stephen Su's lab. And I also gave you two DOIs for a couple of papers that Dr. Su published, where he looked at resistance to a particular insecticide, and then he tested other larvicides to see where did the resistance to the methoprene or the spinosad, which he was discussing in the papers, where does it cross to other larvicides with different modes of action, and where does it not cross and give you the opportunity to regain susceptibility. So that's, I think, all I'm going to say about larvicides. We're in a much better place when it comes to larvicides. But I do want to ask the question, out of which of these strategies is best? And is it moderation, is it saturation, or is it multiple attack? And this is where we are really in a data gap. So when it comes to preventing resistance in the first place, there's not a lot of long-term studies that have shown which one is the best to use. And I suspect that at the end of the day, when we get new products, which with different modes of action, especially for the adulticides, that there is some work and some thought put into trying to figure out which one might be the better way to go. So just quickly, we tend to treat everywhere the same, even though selection pressures are not equal. So if you have a city You have residential areas, you have high density residential areas, you have government areas, you have entertainment areas, you have parks. On the outskirts, you may have agriculture going on. There is not a uniform environment out there. And what we tend to do is to blanket everything using one chemical at one rate everywhere equally, whether there's resistance detected or not. It's much easier to do that, and it can be much cheaper. So your country program could say, this year we're going to buy this product, and everybody's going to use it equally everywhere. What we've heard, and what is true, is that the development of resistance is focal, and the mechanism behind that resistance can be different even to the same chemical. So in some urban areas, you may have resistance develop to, say, permethrin. I'm going to use that as an example because that's what you're using across the board. In some places, that resistance may be a pretty weak mechanism behind it. In other places, that resistance with the same mechanism may be very strong. So there may be just a little bit of increased oxidases in these two areas. These two areas, there's a lot of increased oxidases. In other areas, the resistance to that permethrin may be a different target site. It may different mechanism altogether. And then there could even be a third or a combination of those mechanisms behind that resistance. So what influences which way this goes? Like I said at the beginning, agriculture can be influencing what's going on here, maybe. What's being done in our parks for recreation and to keep like golf courses pretty and the grass perfect year-round can be affecting it. What is happening in industrial areas could be affecting it. So there's a lot of influencers on that resistance to the pyrethroid that can lead to different modes of action. And so our blanket approach of using just one thing across the board everywhere is really not the best strategy. I wish I could tell you, you have permethrin resistance, follow it with chemical X, and then maybe rotate in chemical Y, and it's going to go away. It's never going to be that easy. So the best strategy really is to use data, figure out what those mechanisms are, how bad that resistance is, and then tailor what you do to the area where that insecticide resistance is found based on what you actually found is going on in the area. And this is really a part of integrated mosquito management. This is not something special. You should be doing surveillance for your mosquitoes out there. If you don't have the mosquitoes, you don't have the disease, you don't have a situation where you need to be spraying, maybe you don't need to be spraying. Maybe your response is, this is a high industrial area, and we don't, even though we have resistance there, we don't necessarily need to be doing treatments in that area because people aren't being exposed to our vectors there. So in summary, knowledge and data are going to drive the decisions, whether you rotate chemicals, whether you need to put more emphasis on other control, back off on the adulticiding, do more larviciding, focus more on community cleanup, all of those things that go into integrated mosquito management. All of those are options for you to use. And again, we don't have good, solid information, and every place is going to be unique in what their local problem is. So making a blanket policy on how you're going to respond to insecticide resistance is going to be elusive for us, certainly in the short terms, I should say. And I do want to throw this out here because money is always going to be a factor in the decisions that are made. So if you have areas that don't have resistance, you don't necessarily need to change how you do control. There's no cost difference in what you would be doing with your vector control program. But in areas with resistance, alternating chemicals and using the highest rates, they can affect your bottom line, and they can impact your ability to do mosquito control, because if you're focusing on the resistance and it's taking a lot of your resource in that area, instead of doing that blanket across your entire town or state or country, use those extra resources needed to address that local resistance problem. And then in places where there isn't resistance, having the ability to use your maybe lower cost treatments that you have been using in the past is really the way to go. So I wish that with this talk I could have answered my question, that is there a way to have a single answer for all of this. And unfortunately, when it comes to insecticide resistance, there's not a way. And data and knowledge and education are key to being able to address insecticide resistance for us. And I'm gonna leave off there. My contact information, feel free to reach out if you want to email with additional discussion beyond the panel.